welcome back to the Luke Deckard Show. I'm your host, Luke Deckard. Tonight, I have a really fun guest, like I do most nights. I have Antony Johnston, who is the author of Atomic Blonde. He's written for video games such as the Shadow of Mordor, Resident Evil Village, and a whole bunch of other stuff. He's written a bunch of novels. Basically, has his fingers in a bunch of different pies, which is quite impressive. He's written comic books. He's written for Daredevil. It's great. So much stuff. So I'm excited to chat with him tonight about his latest novel, which is called the Dog Sitter Detective, and also ask him some questions about comic book writing and video game writing, and get some insight into some of that stuff. So if you're here for the first time or not, drop your questions in the chat along the way, and we'll kick off. So without further ado, Antony, welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
I wasn't informed that you'd be seeking insight. I feel like I'm not prepared.
Whatever, insight can be anything that's, it varies, doesn't it? Okay, so let's first chat the Dog Sitter Detective. It's your, as far as I'm aware, it's your most recent outputting. But you put so much stuff out through so many different medias. It's something could have slipped past. Okay, so this was an interesting book. Tell us first a little bit about the books. I think it's probably more entertaining hearing it from you than hearing it from me.
Sure. The Dog Sitter Detective is the story of Gwynnie Tuffle, a retired actress who she gave up acting, retired 10 years ago to look after her father who was ill. He's now passed away and has left her with basically no money, tumble down old house in Chelsea, and no money in the bank. And so she is contemplating trying to restart her acting career at the ripe old age of 60, which is no mean feat, obviously. But in the meantime, she essentially takes up dog sitting to make ends meet. In the first book, before she's doing that, she attends the wedding of another actress friend of hers, Tina, who's marrying a wealthy Italian business magnate who runs an olive oil empire. And this wedding is taking place at Tina's country house in Habenstead in Hertfordshire. Nice little village. Everything's going very well and pleasant. It's a lovely spring day. Everybody's looking forward to a lovely wedding. And then, of course, because this is a murder mystery book, things go very badly wrong. And in fact, instead, there is a murder at the wedding and Tina is accused of the murder. And where the dogs come into it is they are an unexpected wedding gift to Tina, a couple of purebred Saluki hounds, which Tina obviously can't look after while she's, in jail and being interrogated by the police over this murder. And so Gwynnie, who is a lifelong dog person, takes these dogs on and looks after them while also trying to clear her friend's name and solve the murder to uncover the real killer.
Yes. I love it. I'm curious, what was the with Gwynnie? So the idea of this out of work actress, a 60-year-old lady, it's quite interesting protagonist for the novel. Where did she come from?
She came from a number of different places. So I knew there's a whole number of reasons, really. I knew I wanted to have a protagonist who knew dogs and had a lifelong love of and sort of certain expertise with dogs. And so that requires somebody a little bit older.
Right.
I thought it would be interesting if that was a woman rather than the sort of typical male dog trainer that you kind of see a lot of. And I thought it would be also interesting if she was an actress, just because that's not a profession that you see very often in protagonists in any genre, really, but especially in crime. And I have some experience acting myself. I did a lot of acting and sort of theatre and what have you when I was younger, so I know, and I've kept an interest in it through the years, so I know a little about that profession. So yeah, and all these things kind of fell together, but it made sense for her plot wise to be the character she is, but also, as I say, just things of my own interest as well that I thought would be fun to do. That was the thing. I wrote this principally to have fun.
Yeah.
I literally started writing this book to cheer myself up during the first COVID lockdown,
Yeah.
and I wasn't even thinking about publication at the time, really.
Yeah.
But as I wrote it, as I got about halfway through, and from then on, I started thinking, there might be something here,
Yeah.
actually. And that was when I started sounding out friends, sent the rough draft around to a few friends, and said, is there anything here?
Yeah.
Actually, is this any good? And they all said, well, it needs quite a bit of work. And they were right. that rough draft was really rough. But they said, it needs work. But yes, there is something here. This is interesting,
Cool.
and I would read another one. And
Nice.
that's all you want, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially in this genre. You just want people to go, yeah, I like that, and I will happily read another one.
Yes.
What more can you ask for?
I like it. Was there any, because I guess if the first lockdown, we're talking 2020, I'm thinking of other books that are kind of coming out at the time. You've got Sophia Bennett's, S.J. Bennett's Queen novels, the can't remember the name of her first book now, but they're good. Just go look up S.J. Bennett.
Winds or something?
The Winds Are Not. There we go. The Winds Are Not.
Yeah.
And then you also have the other guy who wrote a famous book with old people in it, whose name will not be mentioned. I don't know.
Name escapes me. Yeah.
Yes, he's a very forgetful individual. But it's interesting that there was all of these books coming out kind of around that time with mature protagonists. Was this did you get any inspiration from this stuff because they were all kind of come out around the same time, or was this just a happenstance?
It really was happenstance. I think I can't even remember if I'd read Thursday Murder Club by the time I started writing Dog Sitter. I might have, but I genuinely can't remember. I've read and enjoyed cozies and amateur detective books, and watched a lot of cozy crime on TV as well for years and years and years. So it's not like the genre was unfamiliar to me. And honestly, also even in 2020, yes, Winds Are Not, Thursday Murder Club, and a few other things had come out, but they weren't yet the huge success that we now think of them as, especially Thursday Murder Club, obviously. So I wasn't being cynical in any way, and I wasn't sort of trying to ride a bandwagon. It really was more, like I said, I wanted to write something to cheer myself up during lockdown, and I thought, well, what better than something humorous and with dogs, because I love dogs, that will just sort of put a smile on my face as I'm writing it. But the timing turned out to be very good, as you say, because then people like Sophia and Richard have had this enormous success, and it did kind of open the market up a little. If I'd tried to submit Dog Sitter in 2019, I'm not sure if it would have been picked up. But when we actually did send it around in 2022, there was a lot more interest, and we did have a couple of offers, and we went eventually with Allison and Busby, the publisher that we have. And I'll just tell you quickly, there's a story as to why it took 2 years to submit as well. So, like I said, I wrote this at the start of lockdown, and I was supposed to be writing a spy thriller. I was supposed to be writing the third, you can see it there on the shelf behind me, I was supposed to be writing the Patrios Network, the third Bridgie Sharp book. But those books, being spy thrillers, they rely on international travel and geopolitics and the state of the world. All the things that were completely in flux and up in the air at the start of COVID. This is before vaccines were on the horizon, remember? We were thinking, will airlines even exist in a year's time? So I couldn't write it. I just couldn't possibly write that book. So I had to put it aside. But I'm not one of those people who can just sit and not write. I'm always writing something, as you alluded to in your intro. And so I started writing the Dog Sitter Detective. But by the time I finished that rough draft and sent it around to people, as I say, and got some feedback, vaccines were on the horizon. And so at that point, I restarted writing the Patrios Network. And that carried me through, sort of into 2021, most of 2021, actually, because it's quite a long, complex book. So basically, I finished writing Dog Sitter and then did nothing with it for a year.
Okay, yeah.
And I didn't even tell my agent that I had written it, because at that point I still didn't know if I actually wanted to publish it. I
Right,
still
right.
didn't know, like, because I hadn't written cozy before. Like I say, I've read it,
Yeah,
I know the genre, but I'd
yeah,
never written it, and
yeah.
I'm known more as a sort of hard-boiled spy guy.
Yes,
So I was
yes.
like, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah.
Um, but a year later, yeah, I finally told my agent what I'd done.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thankfully, my agent is very understanding, very open-minded, and she said, "Send it to me, I'll have a read."
Yeah.
And she liked it, and we actually did, when we submitted to publishers, we actually said, as part of the pitch, part of the submission, if somebody wanted to publish it with me writing under a pen name, I would be
Ah,
happy to do that,
right,
to
right.
sort of separate the
Sure.
genre I'm known for from this. But actually, as it turned out, every publisher who showed an interest said, "No, no, we'd like you to publish it under your own name."
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good, healthy sign, I think,
Yeah.
of how the market is developing, not just for cozy, but crime in general. That
Yes.
it is becoming more and more acceptable to write in these different subgenres
Yes.
without, I don't know, sort of tarnishing your reputation.
Yes. I think it's really important. It reminds me of Walter Mosley, who is
Mm.
famous for his historical hard-boiled novels, but also loves to write science fiction. He's always been like, why the F can't I just write what I want? I'll write,
Yep.
why do I need to be forced on and it's also good to, you know, I think I think yeah, I don't necessarily like it when people are sort of backed into a corner and they have to use a pseudonym or a pen name just because they don't want to confuse people. I think audiences they're not as dumb as what we make them out to be sometimes. You know,
Well,
so it's
look
fine.
at how Ian Banks handled it. I mean,
Yes,
that's the perfect way of doing it. Ian Banks, Ian M. Banks.
yes,
It's obviously the same guy. There's no secret about the fact it was the same guy, but
yes,
the M was there just
yes,
so that if you saw that, you went, "Oh, that's one of his sci-fi books."
yes,
Simple
yes.
as that.
Absolutely, absolutely. In the chat, Phil says hello, and also says, "Yeah, it's true. We all had the COVID fears." Well, it's also interesting the COVID. You writing this during that period because I'm just kind of circling the drain of finishing my PhD, and it's a hard boiled focus on hard boiled fiction, and a lot of that research went into looking at where did it emerge from and why did it what was it a reaction to, and a lot of it was a reaction to British fiction at the time, which was predominantly cozy, golden age stuff, is
Golden
very
Age
locked
stuff.
for
Yeah,
mystic
yeah.
code, and but the interesting thing is when you look at what Raymond Chandler's saying, he's like, oh, we need to like crime is like a real deal. We need to like actually address it, not kind of make up these silly little games about it. Whereas when you look at some of the British authors, they're like their approach to it, and some of their American counterparts are saying, look, this is we're writing this right after the First World War. It's terrible. Life is awful. We have a pandemic ourselves, and it is sort of they were making it, they were lighter, fun crime stories that people could just get into and sort of escape in some way, I think. So it's interesting that I think this sort of that was mirrored in this last pandemic, and you kind of were doing that yourself with writing this book.
I think we're definitely seeing a certain amount of people not wanting, or people wanting a bit of escapism,
Yeah,
wanting a bit of light-hearted,
yeah,
escapism, a bit of fantasy. Fine, there's nothing wrong with that, and I think it's perfectly understandable given what we've all just been through.
yeah,
But what's interesting is that we're not seeing uh, a sort of a reversal of fortunes of hard-boiled stuff. There is plenty of
mm,
hard-boiled crime fiction, especially out there
yeah,
right now, that is doing just fine. Right
yes,
high on the bestseller lists.
yes,
People are still reading it. I think, yeah, for whatever reason, I think there's more of an acceptance of a breadth within
yeah,
the genre.
yeah,
Overall, it's not like the genre has to go in this direction or that direction. It can
true,
go in both. It can go in all
yes,
these directions, and there are enough readers, enough buyers out there now
Yes.
to sustain all of that. So yes, cozy is having a resurgence, no question.
Yes.
Like I said, a rising tide lifts all boats, but it's
Yes.
not at the expense of other
No.
subgenres, which is
n-
nice.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Totally agree because yeah, it's interesting. You have books like this, like yours, and I recently read "Killing Jericho," which was very much a
Yeah.
hard-boiled novel, and it was terrific. It's nice to dip into different subgenres. I think rather than just be forced into reading one. As you were saying earlier that you read the cozy genre growing up and you watched it on TV. I was wondering how much inspiration was there at all from Mrs. Marple.
Well, it's Miss Marple for a start.
Miss Marple, sorry, I should know that.
There you go. That's lesson one. I mean, there's some inspiration, obviously. How could there not be?
Mm.
She is without doubt the sort of the cozy
Yeah,
figure.
yeah,
There is no cozy really without Marple, or at least not as we
mm,
know it. So
yeah,
you can't escape that influence, of course.
yeah,
At the same time, and I like Marple. I have, quite a few on my bookshelves right behind me. But at the same time, I wasn't trying to emulate
yeah.
Marple.
No, no.
I mean, you can see that in the book. You can see that, Gwynny is quite a different character. It's not all set in the same little small village where everybody knows one another and that sort
Yeah,
of stuff. I wasn't trying to emulate the books in that sense.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, like I say, the influence is obviously inescapable. The idea of the murder where the puzzle is the focus,
yeah,
which is really, to my mind, that's essentially all that cozy is. You can do pretty much anything else in cozy,
mhm,
but the puzzle of the murder is the focus of the story. And as long as you have that
yes,
and a certain light touch, then you've got a cozy.
yeah,
So yeah, to that extent, obviously, as I say, there was some influence, but I wasn't trying to imitate or emulate
yeah,
Marple by
yeah,
having an older female protagonist. That was
yeah,
just, like I said earlier, that was just how it shook out.
yeah. Yeah, I like that. When you were devising the puzzle, how difficult was that to do? Like, how did you find that quite taxing?
Well, I mean, yes, but also it's what I do.
Yes,
Pretty much everything I write is a mystery of
yes,
one kind or another, and that's whether it's a graphic novel, a screenplay, a book, a short story, comic book, video game, even, no matter what it is, there's always some
yeah,
mystery, some
yeah,
revelation to be discovered.
yeah,
Um, in the course of the story. That's just how my brain works. It's how I like to tell stories.
mhm,
It's what I like to consume myself.
yeah,
Whether I'm reading, watching, whatever. Mysteries are my favorite kind of story as a reader or viewer, and
yes,
they're my favorite kind of stories to tell.
yeah,
Uh, so as I say, I do it a lot, but that doesn't make it any easier.
yes, no,
That's the thing. A good mystery is really hard to plot and to work out, no matter how many times
yes,
you've done it before. Just like writing a book, no matter how many times you've done it before, is still a grueling, workload.
yes,
So yes, it was tricky. And obviously with this one being cozy, there are certain things that you are expected in a cozy that aren't necessarily
yeah,
necessary in a hard boiled or in
yeah,
a spy thriller or
yeah,
something. And that's things like the scene of the body,
yeah,
clues in the crime scene, um,
yes,
that will all, of course, pay off one way or another later.
yeah,
And figuring out how to have an amateur question people, even though they're not, not a
yes,
detective, not a police person, not a police officer. So there's that sort of stuff to figure out. There is a sort of a clockwork element to the puzzle,
yes,
which maybe doesn't have to be quite so rigid in other genres. But
yeah.
overall, yeah, it was no more difficult, but also no easier than plotting any of the Brigitte books or any other mystery that I've written.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I'm curious because obviously whenever there's a dog in a story, whenever the protagonist has a dog, think of Ian Rankin's Rebus, he's always having to worry about the damn dog now. Um, did you find that the dogs complicated the writing process or the plot at all, or was that just easy sailing?
Well, again, yes, they did, but that was kind of the point.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I've heard Ian talk about that and how he regrets ever giving Rebus the dog. He's like, oh God, now I've got to look after the dog and worry about who's walking the dog, who's feeding the dog.
Yeah.
Which is all true. It's absolutely true.
Yep.
But that was part of what I wanted to do in this book. I wanted to write dogs that behave like dogs. That really do, that dog owners will go, oh yeah, I recognize that behavior. My dogs do that, or my neighbor's dogs do that, or whatever.
Yes.
So they behave like dogs and they have the needs of dogs. And I wanted to sort of get across the way that, yeah, when you get a dog, it takes over your life. You know, my partner and I always joke that having a dog is like having a perpetual 3-year-old in the house. They're just old enough to understand what you want them to do, but they're still young enough to be disobedient and not do it anyway. And you can't leave the house without putting a bag together first.
Yes.
You can never leave the house on a whim. It's
No.
you have to, you need at least 30 minutes notice in order to put everything in the bag and make sure you've got all your stuff to go out and leave the house. But like I say, that's part of what I wanted to do with this, because you don't see that in a lot of books.
No.
A lot of books with dogs, it is kind of shunted away. And a dog owner reads it and goes, hang on a minute, when was the dog fed last? You know, who's walking this thing? And so I wanted to really get that across, that it does take over your life and you do have to consider those things. And that will continue in the other books as well. I just finished the first draft of the second book and handed it in to the publisher a few weeks ago. And that's very much a feature of that book as well. It's a different dog, a different location. But the fact that the dog needs constant attention and she can't just go gallivanting off and leave it by itself for days on end or whatever, that is, part of the story. That is an important part of the plot.
Yes. Yeah, I like that. Phil in the chat says it's a great attention to detail for a narrative. Dogs. He also asks, I guess we could sort of, we'll wrap up this. We'll wrap up Dog Sitter in a second here then. So you mentioned that you've just done the second book. So talk us through a little bit about what is to come for the franchise, for the series.
Well, so the second book is set in Little Venice area of London, where three canals famously meet. And Gwynny is hired by an aging rock star who has a houseboat on Little Venice. He's about to go and play a gig in Dublin over a long bank holiday weekend and needs somebody to house sit for his dog. He got a border collie on the boat while he's away doing this gig. And also over the bank holiday weekend, there's a carnival taking place at the pool where these three canals meet. And so Gwynny goes along, stays in his houseboat, looks after the dog. But then during the carnival, the singer's body turns up. And it turns out that he never actually made it out of the country. And so Gwynny now has to look after his dog because he's dead and try and solve his murder, because the police are convinced it's an accident, but Gwynny is convinced that it's not.
Love it. I love it.
I was just going to say, and that sets a template for the rest of the series. Basically, every book will be a new dog and a new location. There'll be other commonalities. Gwynny will be there, obviously. Her sidekick, retired detective chief inspector called Birch.
Yes.
He'll be there in certainly most of the books. And her sort of friends and what have you will make appearances. So there'll be commonalities throughout the book. But the dog will always change, and hopefully I'll be able to set each one in a different location as well.
I love that. Jamie West in the chat wants to know if there's a wiener dog in the next book.
Oh, an accent? No. Like I say, the next book is a border collie, and I haven't planned out what the rest of them are. I mean, who knows? If I'm lucky, I'll get to do a long-running series of these, and I'll get to Dachshunds eventually, I'm sure, but not in the immediate future.
Love it. Okay, so I guess we can kind of pivot from there into some video game chat, because this is interesting to me. Writing for video games seems like a very it's nothing I've ever done, so it seems very daunting. And I'm like, how do you construct gameplay and story and all that kind of stuff? So Phil asks, well, first he says that your biography is sprawling, and as someone familiar with how writing for books, comics, and films goes, I'm extremely curious about how writing for video games happens. So yeah, that's kind of a big question. That kind of sums up everything. How does it happen? What are the details? So maybe let's start with the game and world building? You know, how do you approach a new game?
Well, so the thing is, it's how do you write a video game is one of those questions I get asked a lot.
Yes.
And the thing is that every project's different.
Yeah.
And not just from studio to studio, but even different projects within the same studio, they're always different. It's just the nature of making games, partly because it's such a technology-led industry, but also because the narrative needs are different on every project. So, for example, you mentioned Resident Evil Village, which I wrote a couple of years ago. That was a case where I was brought in relatively early. I think it had been in development for about a year by the time I came on board, and they'd sort of done lots of concepting, built a few models, done lots of concepts, and figured out the setting and the sort of the overall shape of the game. But at that point, what they didn't have was a solid plot throughout the whole game. So I was brought in to help figure out what that plot was going to be, sort of make sure everything made sense, develop the characters, the villains, and the sort of the backstory to a lot of what went on in the environment, and then to write the script. So that's a game where I was fully involved through quite a few stages for a good couple of years.
Yeah.
But equally, there are games I've done where pretty much the whole game is made, and all they need me to do is write some cutscene scripts to kind of go between the levels of gameplay,
Right.
And then there are others where there's somewhere in between where, I might be brought on and asked to figure out a story, but actually there's not a lot of wiggle room because it's already been in development for 2 years or something. And I can't change any of the characters. I just have to figure out how to make a story with these characters and move them around, that sort of thing. So it really is different from project to project. And the amount of time spent on each of those parts is really different as well. Like, some projects you might be world building for 6 months to a year or more.
Yeah.
I ran the writer's room for a game, which still isn't announced. So games is full of NDAs. A lot of what I do, I'm not allowed to talk about until it's like released almost. Yeah. So I ran the writer's room for a game a couple of years ago. And so that was me and 3 other writers in the room. And I ran that for a year. And all we did was world building. Like all we were doing was building the world, coming up with sort of the history and mythology and backstory of where this game was taking place, creating characters, relationship dynamics between those characters and so on. But we didn't actually write any scripts for the game until the very, very end of that process. Yeah, it's, as I say, that's not that unusual.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I say, it's different on every single project, but that's one of the things I like about it. I mean, I joke that if you want to have a career in video games, you have to kind of thrive in chaos a little bit, because it really is a chaotic business, and you never know what you're going to be doing from one job to the next. But I kind of like that about it. That's why I work in so many different genres and media as well, because I like doing new and different things.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you're working on the game that you're working on now that you can't talk about, versus I guess with Resident Evil, you were quite involved with that one. What's an example of one of the games you worked on where it was maybe more was put together, and you were but you were still needed to kind of script stuff out, and deal with, for example, maybe what about Shadow of Mordor? That's one to ask about, actually.
Oh, well,
working with one that's like a massive established lore because of Tolkien, all that kind of stuff. What was that one like?
Well, Shadow of Mordor is this again goes to what I was saying about every job being different. So on Shadow of Mordor, I wasn't actually involved in the main story. So the sort of the main, what we call the core story of Celebrimbor and all of that, his tale, that wasn't actually my purview at all.
Right.
What I was brought in to do, so I assume you've played the game.
I've not played.
Yeah.
I'm.
Okay.
This is why video games are so interesting to me, because the last video game I legitimately played was like Mario on the Wii.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. So in Shadow of Mordor, the main enemy that you fight are orcs.
Yeah.
And there is a system within the game
Mm.
called the Nemesis system.
Mhm.
And what it does is every time you play the game, it procedurally generates. And what that means is the computer sort of randomizes bits to come up with new stuff.
Mhm.
All of the orcs
Mhm.
that you will face each time, all of the orc captains, I think they're called. It's
Right.
been a few years now. I can't quite remember. So there are, there are just the rank and file orcs that you slaughter your way through as you do. But then there are the captains, and these are the orcs that speak and have personalities
Mhm.
and that will recur. These are the ones that are created by this system. And they remember you.
Mm. Mm.
So if you fight one of these orc captains and you don't kill them, you
Right.
might injure them quite badly, but sort of don't kill them and then leave them to die and you go off. If you encounter them again, they will
Right.
remember
Well, that's
that
cool.
they fought you before and that you won. And they will also do things like ambush you,
Right.
and sort of gang up on you and what have you. And my job
Yes.
was to write the lines that they say to you before they attack, which indicate that they remember you or
Right.
reveal their personality. They taunt you before you fight one of these orc captains.
Yeah.
That they taunt you and sort of threaten you and try and intimidate you. And
Yeah.
also, if one of them kills you, they will insult your corpse as you die. That's the other thing. So it was my job to write all of those lines, and I think there were 4,000 of them. It was an enormous amount of work. It took me months to do. I was a little bit crazy by the end of it, if I'm honest.
Yes.
But somebody had to do it, and it's actually, even though it wasn't the core story in the game, it's actually one of the things that players remember the most because it was such a fun, innovative system.
Yes.
I mean, other games have done the same thing now, but at the time it was very new because it was very complex to put together, very sort of resource intensive. Like I say, games is a technology-led industry. And so it actually turned out to be a really major part of the game. And one of the things that most people remember very fondly about the game, even though I wouldn't say it was throwaway, because like I say, it was a lot of work, but it wasn't, I was under no illusions that I was doing something, I wasn't writing the hero's plot or anything like that. I was literally just writing 4,000 orc insults.
I love that. That's quite fascinating. So it's very much a sort of an interesting collaboration of at various levels. It sort of reminds me of, I think because I recently watched that Stanley documentary on Disney Plus, that I think is a little bit too much polishing Stan's dick a little bit, but
Probably. I
but
haven't seen it, but it wouldn't surprise me.
yeah, it's too glossy, but there are a couple of bits in there where they they get some of the controversy is addressed a little bit, but they still try and make him too much of a superhero. But what was it? My point of that is it sort of reminds me of how you would have the artists who are really the comic books, the actual illustrators who are putting the story together, and then he's coming in and writing dialogue and kind of piecing it together. So it's fascinating that video games in some way kind of can operate in that kind of system a little bit.
It can do. I mean, it's not ideal, to be clear. I'd rather, I prefer not to work that way. But yeah, sometimes it is the way that it's, that you need to work and it can be done. I should say comics almost never works that way anymore. That was something that came about because of the need to produce enormous quantities of work very, very quickly. And I mean, comics is still a very fast moving business compared to something like, say, novels or film. But we don't do that anymore in comics because it's generally accepted that you'll get a better product if it starts with a full script from a writer that the artist is following, rather than 2 paragraphs of plot that the artist then figures out.
Yes, exactly. So kind of going back to world building a little bit. how do you sort of, I guess, pick and choose elements that you want to develop within the game? Like if you're doing a sci-fi game, what are you taking from the genre to kind of put into the game and make it work, and where are you taking influences from and things like that?
It depends on what the game needs. This is the thing. As important as narrative and writing in video game is, and obviously I consider it to be very important,
Yeah.
it's still not as important as gameplay.
Yeah.
You know, there are certain types of games that are often derisively called walking simulators, which are almost no gameplay and are actually just a story. But that aside, that sort of subgenre aside, gameplay, what you're doing with the controller, the experience of moving through the world as a character,
Yeah.
is still the most important thing.
Yes.
And so everything that every other department does, including narrative, is in service to that, is in service to that game design. And so this is why it's impossible to answer any of these questions definitively, because again, I keep saying it's different every time. There might be, let's say I'm working on a sci-fi game which takes place on an alien planet. Well, then there are going to be aliens. So now we need to figure out, who are these aliens? How did they evolve? What's their history? Are you going to speak to any of the aliens, or do you just kill them? Because let's face it, a lot of games, unfortunately, are obsessed with just killing everything in your path. Like, if you're not going to talk to them, well, then you're not going to learn a lot about them. That means those aliens probably we don't need to figure out what their mythology is, what their religions are, if they have different strata in their society. That's probably not important. But if you do speak to them, if they're characters that you can have a conversation with, then we probably do need to figure those things out. We do need to figure out what's their attitude towards society. How do they configure their metropolitan areas, if they have them, their communal areas? Do they have religion? Are there different religions? Do they have competing religions? That sort of thing. So it all really depends on what the player is going to do as they move through the world. And everything that they kind of interact with, we figure out, okay, how much do we need to write in order for the player to have the best and fullest experience as they are having that interaction. And sometimes that's a lot, and sometimes it's not much at all. But it really does all depend on. It's a bit like, I suppose you could make a comparison or an analogy, if you like, with old Hollywood sets, where it was just the facades. You just get the front of the building and there's nothing behind them. I mean, I say old Hollywood, there are still some sets, they still build them like that sometimes, because you're never going to see behind the house. You're never going to go into that house. You're never going to move the camera in a way that shows you what's behind. So you don't need to build it. And it's the same with games. If the player isn't going to see it, you don't really need to build it. And games are such an expensive, resource intensive thing to develop that if you don't need to build it, you're not going to build it.
That makes perfect sense. Phil asks, so in the case of Village, aside from Redfield and other recurring characters, were the other new characters already designed, or were you tasked to create them?
A little bit of both. So they were visually designed. So, for example, the most famous one being Lady Dimitrescu, the 9-foot tall vampire countess, who everybody fell in love with, much to everyone on the team's surprise, I should say, by the way. None of us were prepared for the enormous popularity of that character, which I think is slight spoilers, but the game's been out for a while now, so I think that's fairly evident just by the fact that she is the first villain that you encounter, and she's dead a quarter of the way into the game. I think a lot of people expected her to be the main villain, and so when she took off in popularity, we were like, oh god, do they realize?
Shit.
But Capcom kind of lent into it and did actually make more of her than was originally going to be planned, just because she was so popular. So again, visually she was already designed. Her appearance, I mean, it wasn't finalized. I think her dress changed a little during development, that sort of thing, but basically visually she was designed. So were her daughters, and so were the other 4 lords, as we call them. But their personalities, their characters weren't yet developed, and that's partly because we hadn't figured out the plot that would run through the whole story, and that plot obviously affects their personalities. Their backstory affects their personalities, so a lot of that was down to me to figure out. I mean, when I started on the project, I went to Osaka for a week, and we basically spent that entire week in a room with the game director, the animation director, the live action mocap director, an in-house writer from the team, and a translator liaison. And a couple of other people drifted in and out, but that was the core. And we spent that week just trying to figure out the answers to those questions and figure out who these characters were, what the story was, where we were going to place certain beats of the story throughout the plot. Although I should say, we came out of that room at the end of that week going, we've got it. We've done it. Yes. Brilliant. We know everything. And then within like 2 months, everything had changed. Oh, actually, no, we don't know everything. But that's, again, you have to thrive in chaos. That's game development for you. But so the development of the character's personality and, of course, the lines that they say, those were all from me. In collaboration, but I came up with those. But like I say, visually they were already designed, and that's the great collaboration that you can get in games. It is a very collaborative medium when you're making games, and that's one of the things I like about it. It gives me it's a nice contrast to writing a novel where it's just me on my own in this room furiously typing, or more often staring out the window and wishing I was furiously typing.
Yes. So I'm curious, because you mentioned that you felt you nailed it all down, and then a few weeks later it wasn't as nailed down as what you were hoping. I'm curious, what were those things that you thought were nailed, and then suddenly we're like, oh, we got to go back to we got to go back to work here?
I honestly can't remember the specifics now. It was just sort of the overall arc of the story and the order of events and that sort of thing. It was and then some of the backstory as well. Things that like I say, we thought we'd figured out, and then a couple of months later, once people started to build them, or once we started stress testing essentially the plot, we were like, oh no, actually that doesn't work, we need to change things. But like I say, that's normal. That happens all the time.
Okay, so you also mentioned earlier about gameplay. So who writes the gameplay? How does that get done?
That's what game design is. That's essentially what when you see somebody called a game designer, that's essentially what they do, is they figure out. I mean, game design is a very broad broad church, as it were, but what they essentially do is figure out what the gameplay is going to be. What can this character do? Is it a side-scrolling jumpy game, or is it a sort of Doom style first-person shooter, move through a 3D world game? Can you jump? Can you not jump? Are there power-ups? Are there health pickups? What sort of enemies are you going to be facing? Those are the things that a game designer figures out. And then within that, there's a sort of, I suppose it's kind of a subclass of game designer, although you could argue it's a separate discipline as well, and that's level designer. And those are the people who very specifically figure out the individual areas that you move through as a character in a game, whether that's, again, a side-scrolling environment or a 3D area in something like a game like Doom, or whether it's a quest in, say, you play something like Horizon, one of the Horizon games, and obviously those don't have the enclosed environments of something like a Doom, but they do have specific quests. Witcher, and or other games that have where you pick up a quest from somebody and then you go to an area and you do that quest. Level designers take care of how that quest unfolds and what takes place during it, the story of that particular mission, if you like. But they're all under the aegis. We're all really under the aegis of the overall game designer.
Right. So those people who are designing those moments, then are they in collaboration at all with say you guys who are doing dialogue and things like that, or is it just
no, there's always there's always collaboration, meetings, a lot of meetings in game design. In game development, there's always meetings, there's always back and forth. There's always collaboration. A good game designer will basically collaborate with all of the department, or a game director sometimes will collaborate with all of the different sort of department heads, take everything on board and figure things out in tandem with them. But like say a feature director, at the end of the day, what they say goes, you know.
Yes.
And so we're all working, as I say, under their purview, under their aegis, and following their vision.
Cool. Phil asks, were the developers protective over the mainstays like Redfield?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Of course they were. You know, this is a franchise character who literally the entire franchise is built around this character. So yes, we could still have a bit of fun with them. You know, they let me have fun with Ethan. They let me have some fun with Redfield. They let me have fun with, you know, sort of elements of the franchise. But yes, naturally, the things that recur throughout the franchise, they were quite protective of, because, like I say, that's the franchise, that's their IP, and that's their cash cow.
Yeah. This might be an impossible question to ask, maybe, or answer, maybe. But I was wondering, what was?
I've already had a few. Go on.
Yeah, I know, right? What was? Is there a particular game that was maybe the hardest to do the world building for that you've worked on? What was the one that was the hardest? And why?
So the real answer to that actually is that game where I ran the writer's room for a year, and I can't tell you what it is. I will say there is a game where I didn't run the writer's room, but I was a narrative consultant on an interactive web series, Silent Hill Ascension, which is going live later this year. And I can talk about that now because it's been announced. I worked on that for nearly 18 months without being able to tell a soul about it. That's that happens all the time in games. And I was collaborating with Bad Robot and Gemvid over in the US to sort of help put that together. And yeah, like I say, I was in the writer's room, but I was a consultant rather than one of the staff writers or a script writer, and somebody else was actually running the room. But that was one where we had to do a lot of world building up front. Like a lot, again, pretty much a year of world building before we could even think about writing scripts. And that was really difficult, partly because of the nature of the product, and partly because, and I don't want to give too much away, but there are elements. I'm a huge Silent Hill fan, I should say. I absolutely love that franchise and those games. And there are, and I say that because I'm about to say there are elements of what we did that are new and innovative to the Silent Hill franchise and to Silent Hill sort of as a concept and as an idea. And so, like I say, I want to make sure people understand they were done with love, and they're we were enormously respectful of the franchise, but we were asked, we were specifically asked by Konami to come up with certain innovations and to sort of push the boundaries a little bit of Silent Hill. But yeah, that was hard. It was a lot of hard work, a lot of people involved. But the end result was worth it. You know, I think what we got out of it was something really solid. And I'm no longer involved. I'm working on a different game now. My sort of contract came to an end, and I'm no longer involved on that project, but I'm really looking forward to seeing it when it comes out later this year.
Wonderful. Okay, let's maybe pivot and because we got about 12-ish minutes left.
Time flies.
I know, right? I want to chat Atomic Blonde a little bit. I know ages ago, we chatted about this at some CWA thing many moons ago. So I kind of want to go back over some of that stuff. So Atomic Blonde, originally called The Coldest Nights, and illustrated.
Coldest City.
Say again.
Coldest City.
Coldest City. Why did I get that wrong?
I don't know.
What is wrong with me today? God damn it! I'm gonna blame the child. I'm totally blaming the child.
It's blame everything on the kids. Yeah,
it's all her fault. I haven't slept in months. Okay, so illustrated by Sam Hart. The graphic novel is great. I read it for the first time a couple of years ago and absolutely loved it. Really enjoyed the movie as well. But they're two very, very different things, which is what I found really interesting. So more focusing on the book at this point. What was your inspiration for the graphic novel?
Quite simply, Cold War spy fiction. You know, John le Carré, Len Dayton, and, you know, the classics, stuff like that. And what happened there was that I had people who don't know the market may not realize that a lot of comics writing, you're writing to order, as it were. Like you mentioned that I wrote Daredevil for a couple of years. I co-wrote that with my friend Andy Diggle, and we were writing to order. You know, Andy had gone in with a pitch, but nevertheless, it was kind of, we don't own those characters.
Yes.
We weren't fully in control of what happened to them because they cross over into other titles,
Yes.
and that's the gig, that going in, it's fine. But obviously with games, there's a certain element of that as well, where you don't, especially if it's a franchise, you don't own the characters. It's not your creation.
Yeah.
And what happened was, for a few years, I'd been doing almost nothing but that sort of work.
Right.
And the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall was fast approaching.
Yeah.
So that was 1989, and this was 2008. I started thinking about Coldest City. I remember the Berlin Wall falling like that very, very vividly. I was 17 at the time, and I remember watching it live on BBC, watching the live images of people standing on top of the wall and hammering pieces out of it and stuff. And there was a real sense that things were going to change. There's a real sense of history being made. Which is why I remember it so well. It had quite an effect on me, partly because I had grown up with the Iron Curtain and the threat of nuclear annihilation as an ever-present constant. Pretty much everybody in Europe did in the 1980s.
Yes.
So I thought, wouldn't it be cool to write something that kind of coincides with that anniversary of the fall of the wall and involves the fall of the wall? And like I say, I love Cold War spy fiction. I always have. And nobody at the time, there were a few spy series extant in comics, but at the time, nobody was doing what I considered to be classic John le Carré style Cold War spy fiction.
Yes.
In the comics form. Yes. And I thought, well, then why not me? Why not have a go? And so that's exactly what I did. And that's, if I wanted to do the equivalent of a le Carré novel in graphic novel form, and that's why it's in black and white. That was an artistic choice. That's why it is very stark and noir, very subdued. There isn't a lot of action in the graphic novel, and as you say, that means that when you watch the movie, it's very you're like, wait a second, there's color everywhere, and she's punching and kicking, and action all over the place. But actually, I will say that the actual story and the characters of the movie are basically the same. It is actually really faithful.
Yes.
Much more faithful than it could have been. What's different is the tone and the style and all the added action. But even there, the action takes place in ways that in the graphic novel, you could imagine it sort of being off screen,
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Like I say, it doesn't play too much with the actual story or the characters of the graphic novel, which was very gratifying, obviously. But like I say, I really just wanted to make a noirish Cold War spy thriller in the le Carré vein, and I think we succeeded in that.
Oh no, I think you do as well. I think at one point I related it to Ian Fleming, and you're like, it's not Ian Fleming, you stupid idiot. And I was like, it's kind of is, but no, le Carré is definitely the
more le Carré than Fleming. I mean, because of the Cold War thing, yes, obviously you're going to have certain elements, and again, if people haven't read Ian Fleming's books, they are very different to the Bond films. They are a bit more down at heel, a bit more sort of dour and dirty. So yes, there's sort of an element in there for sure.
Yes, definitely not Bond movies. Not comparing, not at all. Was Atomic Blonde the movie? Was that? I can't remember which came out first. If it was John Wick or it was Atomic Blonde. Did one of
John
those?
Wick.
Okay. Did that influence this? What was going to happen with that in terms of action and all that kind of stuff?
Oh, totally, yeah. Because Dave Leitch, who directed Atomic Blonde, was one of the co-directors of John Wick. That's why he was hired. That's how he got the gig. Was on the strength of John Wick. I think because of Directors Guild rules, I think Chad Stahelski, his partner, is the one who's actually credited as directing John Wick. But Dave was a co-director, no question. And so Atomic Blonde was his first solo directorial credit. But he had been a stuntman, a stunt coordinator, and a second unit director for years and years and years, literally like 20 years or so, before he did Atomic Blonde. So even though it was his first solo directorial work, he was pretty much an old hand by that point. There was no question that he knew what he was doing. But yes, so as I say, John Wick was pretty much why he was offered the gig.
that's
Chad and Dave were actually going to do Atomic Blonde together at first, but then John Wick 2 rolled around and the schedules clashed.
right.
And so they had to decide, well, who's going to do which. And so Chad went to focus on the John Wick series, and Dave decided to do Atomic Blonde, and then obviously all the other work that he's done since.
Yes, that's interesting. So this is more of a writery question for you then, and I know the answer, but the audience might not. Given that there were certain big changes from the book into the comic, I won't give spoilers away in case people haven't read or haven't seen, which go read and watch if you haven't, because they're both really good. But there are some things towards the end that are a bit different. I'm from your perspective, from the original writer perspective, does any of that bother you, or because you already work in these fields where you can't be too precious, did it not bother you?
That's exactly it. It didn't bother me at all. I have done adaptations myself.
Yeah.
So I have done quite a few jobs where I have adapted prose into comics.
Yeah.
And in doing so, you have to change things. You have to change things to fit the medium. And so I knew that would happen. I mean, I was a co-producer on Atomic Blonde as well. So I'd seen the screenplay. I read the screenplay and gave notes, you know, before it even went anywhere near principal photography. So I knew that there would be changes in any case. In fact, there were far more changes in the very first draft of the script than wind up on screen. At one point, there was a helicopter gunship. It was, it was quite serious. So I knew there would be changes, and I was fine with it. What I said, and I literally said this to both Charlize and Dave when I was on set, because everybody was like, "Oh, the writer's here. Oh, we've changed some things. Or I hope you don't mind." I mean, and if I'd said yes, I do mind, it wouldn't have mattered anyway, because you know, they were calling the shots on that project. But what I said to them, and I mean this, what I said to them is, I think I say this on the extras on the DVD as well. I'm on the Talking Heads bit, you know, the DVD extras, and I think I say the same thing there, which is what I said to them was, I have already written the best graphic novel that I can. Now it is up to you to make the best movie that you can. And if that means changing things, that is absolutely fine by me. What I want out of this process is the best movie possible. I do not care how faithful it is. Now, it's nice that it was faithful. As I say, remarkably faithful, and that's very gratifying. But that's in service to making a good film. And that's the most important thing. The Bourne Identity was the comparison that I always make. If you've read the book of The Bourne Identity, it's nothing like that movie. There are a couple of points of commonality, but everything else and the actual story is completely different. And nobody cares. It's a great book.
Correct.
It's a great film. Don't care that they're different. Blade Runner being another great example. You know, great book, great film. Don't care that they're completely different. And so that was my attitude towards Atomic Blonde as well. It was like, just make a great movie. That's all I care about.
It is interesting that there are certain things that can be adapted and radically different to their source, and both still be equally good and great.
It's the art of adaptation.
It's fascinating that certain things can, but then there's other things that just fumble with it. Like I don't like. I'll go with a deep cut. Prince Caspian, the Disney Prince Caspian. I feel like that's a safe one to mention.
I'm not familiar with either the book or the movie. So
you know, it's a terrible adaptation. It deviates. I think it's when deviation is just pointless. Where there's certain things that are basically the same, but but one is deviated for a reason that doesn't really make sense. Where I think that's where things begin. Like, I don't know why you've done this. Whereas, like the Bourne movies, I love the Bourne movies. They're nothing like the books. I love them though. They nail it. Or I mean, Lord of the Rings is another good example of being, you know, they give different characters different bits of dialogue, and they move some scenes around here and there, like, you know, Merry and Pippin getting sucked into the tree actually happens, not in you know, like all that kind of stuff. None of that bothered me, because it was like they were still being true to the, you know,
to the essence, the spirit.
And Yeah, which I love. But then I guess, yeah, I won't mention any other newer stuff because it's fine.
But no, it's like I say, that's the art of adaptation,
Yeah.
And in the case of films as well and characters, that's also important. Like one of the things that really reassured me actually was the first day I was on set in Budapest was when they were filming some scenes in the interrogation booth when Charlize's character comes back and she's, being interrogated by Toby Jones and John Goodman's characters.
Yeah.
And just watching them do that and talking to Charlize a little bit in between takes, I could tell that she understood the character.
Yeah.
That she got Lorraine. She understood what I was trying to do, what that character was about, why she was the way she was. She just got it. She absolutely got it. And honestly, at that moment, it was like a weight lifted from my shoulders, because obviously she's the star. It was her company that optioned the book. It was her production company.
Right.
So it all revolved around how much Charlize got this character, really. And got this story. And she did. She absolutely did. And so, that was when I realized that, I just, I almost visibly relaxed. I was sitting in Video Village in a chair watching it, and I was like, oh, thank God she gets it. And she really did. And I think, I think you see that in the film. She really understood the core, the essence of that character. Again, there are changes, no question. She says different things. She behaves in different ways. She's a much more kinetic character. But at the core of it, at the essence, she is that same character. And Charlize understood that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I thought she was wonderful. Really, 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 really good. That's what I'm saying. It's they're different, but they're both great, and you can see the commonalities between the two, which is I thought it was handled really well. So I guess people might be curious as to what's going on with the sequel.
All I can say is that a sequel is planned, and we are hopeful that there will be further news on that front soon. That's really all I can say. And I mean, and people might take that and assume that therefore, we're about to start filming tomorrow or something. That's not the case. Everything could fall through and it might never happen. That is the way of Hollywood. True. But everybody involved is feeling very good and positive. And there are moves are being made towards making it happen. So watch this space, as they say.
Cool. Very, very excited. Fingers crossed that it all goes through. Well, I guess we can kind of wrap up now. Anthony, this was a lot of fun to chat video games, Atomic Blonde, Dog Sitter Detective.
I can't believe it's over already. I can't believe an hour's gone by so quickly.
I know they go really quick, and then I'm always like, I want to keep going, but people have lives.
So did the audience, to be fair.
Exactly. So where can people find you on social media?
They can find me at my username, which is there on screen right now. That is my username on just about every social media platform you can find. I am both cursed and blessed to have two names that have unusual spellings and are always misspelled as a result. But the blessing is, it's normally pretty easy for me to get my name on a new social media platform when it fires up. So and my website is just my name.com, antonyjohnston.com. That's got information about all my books and sections on video game work. It's got my graphic novel stuff. It has a section of advice for writers.
Yes, I was going to mention that.
Lots of some free articles and links to videos of my lectures and what have you on writing and the process and that sort of thing. Which I gladly give away for free because, a lot of, I don't believe in mystifying the art and process of writing. It is an art, no question, but it is also a craft and a skill. And you can, you can't, I can't teach people inspiration, but what I can do is teach them how to take that inspiration and then make the best story possible out of it. And so that's what I try to do in that section. And as I say, information about all my work. You can also go to dogsitterdetective.com for specific information just about that book, or to organized-writer.com, which is my non-fiction book. We didn't even talk about that.
No, we didn't.
It's all about writing lots and lots of different things and how to stay on top of your deadlines.
Yes, yes. The organized writer or something that's a whole other episode. That's a whole other episode. But yeah, go find Anthony. Go buy his books and check out his website. There's a lot of good stuff on there. There will be links in the description of this video, or if you're listening to this on Spotify, there'll be links in that description as well for you to go find all of this wonderful stuff. Cool. Well, this was a lot of fun, and hopefully we'll have you back in the future to chat about some other stuff.
I would love to come back and talk some more, about all the things that we didn't get time to get to.
Exactly. Cool. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. We will see you next time. I am back next week. I don't remember. I'm talking with someone. You'll find out on social media. This is how my life has to go now. See you guys.